Beyond Light was another major turning point in the Destiny franchise, and Bungie had a lot to prove not just with this expansion, but with their support of Destiny in the months and years that followed. It marked not only a new future, where Destiny 3 was never going to happen anytime soon, but it also marked a change that a lot of players were never going to be happy with, and that was the Destiny Content Vault. We already discussed the DCV in the Shadowkeep Seasons video, but now was when that idea had finally taken effect, and it left Beyond Light feeling a bit empty. Not because the expansion was small, mind you, but it was the only addition to the game at the same time that a metric ton of content was being taken out, making the current Destiny 2 feel smaller than the one players had had only a few days prior. So it was up to the renewed seasonal model to sort of fill out the game and give players plenty of reason to be excited for the future, which led to, arguably, Destiny's best ever year of constant support. That, however, did not begin with the season that released alongside Beyond Light, beginning the very same day as the expansion was Season of the Hunt. All the way back during Forsaken, after players completed several weekly quests that involved meeting with Mara Sov, Queen of the Awoken, we were treated to a surprise cutscene where Uldren Sov, the antagonist of that expansion, and her brother was brought back to life by a ghost. In this season, we learned that he was in fact a Guardian, roaming the wastes with no memory of his past life, much like any other Guardian. Being Cayde 6's murderer, however, meant that he was not welcome in the tower, which led to him working for our favorite fallen outlaw, the Spider. Uldren's new name is now Crow, and we learned of his existence while Osiris takes a little excursion to the moon to learn about traces of one of the hive gods, Xivu Arath. In the chaos, he is attacked and his ghost Sagira is killed in the fighting, leaving Osiris entirely mortal. Crow is the one that comes to Osiris's rescue, and he agrees to help us follow up on Osiris's lead since Osiris himself is pretty much out of commission with his newfound mortality. This season mainly saw players tracking down ritual sites where Xivu Arath's different Wrathborn could be found. This would be done with a device known as the Cryptolith, which is essentially a lure used to bring these Wrathborn out and challenge them. Functionally, it was also a way for players to somewhat roll for specific weapons and armor, or at least narrow down the odds that they could get exactly what they wanted. Each Wrathborn hunt was essentially this: plug in the lure, go to the ritual site, damage the boss, then chase it as it ran away to a designated location and finish it off. Every Wrathborn hunt was about a 5 to 10 minute affair, and yeah, this was the bulk of what the season amounted to. Just farming these hunts over and over again until you got some well-rolled armor and the best possible rolls of the few weapons introduced that season. It was not great. Which sucks, because from a story perspective, Crow was nothing short of a hit from the start, and this was only further exemplified through the exotic mission Harbinger, which was released much later in the season. While being a fun and interesting romp through the European Dead Zone with a few neat encounters along the way, it was also a great look into the turmoil and doubt that a character like Crow would feel in reconciling with a past that isn't actually his, and being an outcast for it. The reward for completing this mission was the one and only Hawkmoon, which would come to be Crow's defining weapon in the same way Cayde 6's was Ace of Spades. Rather than shooting lucky bullets like in Destiny 1, Hawkmoon would now build up energy with every precision hit or kill landed in the magazine. The more you got, the stronger its final bullet would be, and the stacking was exponential, allowing some really insane damage with maximum stacks. The seasonal exotic was a shotgun known as Duality, and befitting of its name, could fire a single slug when aiming down sights, or standard buckshot when fired from the hip, with perks that synergize with both if you can land a lot of kills in quick succession. The season would come to an end with a final bout against Xivu Arath's chief Wrathborn and the one that killed Sagira, known as the High Celebrant. This was a more proper mission that took place in the Dreaming City, but it was a bit too little too late. The very small amount of content this season offered was not lost on players, and only exacerbated their feelings towards where Destiny seemed to be headed. Even with the expectations that any season that releases alongside an expansion is going to be a bit smaller, Season of the Hunt was far too small by anyone's standards, and thus is looked back on as one of the worst in Destiny's history. Fortunately, players had no idea what was in store for them in the next one. Season of the Hunt came to an end on February 9th, 2021, and was followed by Season of the Chosen. With stasis in hand, hints of Xivu Arath in the system, and a new ally on our side, a lot seem to be turning in the favor of the Guardians. But in fleeing from their homeworld, the remaining Cabal have come to our system to challenge us for the right to rule it all. Their leader, the daughter of Emperor Callus herself, who goes by the name of Keitel. In negotiations with the Vanguard, Commander Zavala agrees to challenge the Cabal on their own terms in ritual combat and by proving that we are indeed stronger. Keitel hands over the hammer of proving and the games begin. Season of the Chosen saw a sort of revised version of the 5x5 grid from seasons past, but implemented much more intelligently. A new Vanguard base of operations was introduced to the game known as the Helm, and this is where all future seasonal content would operate. From here, we would form strategies and plans of attack, as well as focus, collect, and optimize our gear. During Season of the Chosen, we would battle Keitel's champions in activities known as Battlegrounds. 3-player activities not unlike strikes, but much more combat-heavy affairs with a lot of enemy density, something players had been asking for quite some time now. Players would drop in, battle through a few combat encounters before taking on a big boss at the end, accompanied by large waves of enemies. Again, not unlike strikes, but a good reminder that the problem with strikes hadn't been the structure, but rather how easy they'd become from a combat perspective. Over the course of the season, more and more of these battlegrounds would release, culminating in the final challenge, which was a much more proper strike known as Proving Grounds. This was where we would battle Keitel's ultimate champion, forcing her to agree to our terms and admit defeat in her attempt to conquer our system. A more amicable result than the events of the Red War. In the midst of this, however, and due to the more cooperative nature of this season's events, we would actually help Keitel in a few activities, chiefly the Presage mission, which saw players seek out a Guardian distress signal aboard a Cabal ship, where traces of Emperor Callus would be found. In completing this mission, players would receive the Dead Man's Tale exotic scout rifle, a first-of-its-kind bolt-action rifle that had dealt high damage at the longest ranges of any scout rifle yet, and fired even faster from the hip, although this aspect of the weapon was later changed because it was deemed too powerful. Its only downside was that rounds could only be reloaded 2 at a time, making it a bit slow to use, but very rewarding when used correctly. The seasonal weapon was a solar bow called Tiku's Divination, which would fire arrows that would tag multiple enemies that didn't do very much damage at first. These tagged enemies could then be activated while firing another follow-up volley. Once activated, these arrows would explode and chain damage to each other. Season of the Chosen also saw the return of a few old strikes, being Devil's Lair and Fallen Saber from Destiny 1, to supplement and bolster the game's content just a bit more, only adding to the dense amount of actual playable stuff that Season of the Chosen had. The difference between this season and the last was night and day, and assuaged a lot of people's fears about the future, even if it didn't totally numb the sting of the content vault. Players did agree that, at the very least, if this is how future seasons would be, then maybe it wasn't going to be so bad after all. Season of the Chosen came to an end on May 11th, 2021, and was followed up by Season of the Splicer. As Destiny's story continued to slough off many of its old habits, one lingering question in the back of players' minds was, what the hell ever happened to the 3 factions? Dead Orbit, New Monarchy, and Future War Cult had all been integral parts of Destiny 1's progression system, but also the first year of Destiny 2 with the much maligned faction rally activity. After that, we hadn't heard hide nor hair of factions since, but they would return with a vengeance in Season of the Splicer, or more specifically, the Future War Cult would. As the last city had now formed a tenuous alliance with the Cabal, there had already been rumblings of some good Elixni, which we know as Fallen, out there in the system trying to make it by. Way back in the Red War campaign, we'd had a run-in with a Fallen captain by the name of Mithrax, who would proceed to have friendly encounters with other Guardians throughout the lore over the following years. Season of the Splicer saw us answering a distress call from Mithrax, Kel of the House of Light, who's trying to shelter his people while also warning us of a Vex simulation that is attempting to destroy not just them, but the entire system. This simulation is being directed by Quria, Blade Transform, a very powerful Vex from the lore who was very infamously taken by Oryx after absolutely embarrassing Crota, which caused him to be banished, setting up the events of the very first ever Destiny DLC way back in the day. We bring Mithrax and his people back to the last city to figure out how to stop this simulation, but in the midst of it all, politics are at play, as the leader of the Future War Cult, Lakshmi II, isn't particularly happy about this arrangement. She riles up the citizens of the city in defiance of the Vanguard, as though we are sheltering the enemy. This causes a whole lot of background turmoil while we're just trying to do our damn job. Mithrax teaches us about the way of splicing, which allows us to literally fight our way through the physical manifestation of the Vex network, and to put a stop to the Vex's plans. There are 2 different activity types from this season, Expunge and Override. Expunge missions were sort of the story missions of the season, solo to 3-player activities in the thick of the Vex network that would end in a boss fight after numerous platforming and combat challenges. Override was the match-made 6-player activity, where players would fight waves of Vex while completing bonus tasks to speed along progression. progression. Once the progress bar was filled, they would be dropped into the Vex network where they would do battle against a boss at the end. On top of all of this, players were also treated to a returning raid from Destiny 1, the Vault of Glass, which saw a few updates and changes to make it a bit more respectable in an entirely different version of Destiny than the one it had originally released in, and befitting of the Vex-themed nature of this season. But because there was a raid and not an exotic mission, the seasonal exotic had to stand on its own this time around, a stasis sidearm known as Cryosthesia 77K. After getting a kill with this weapon, upon reloading, it would charge an AoE stasis blast that would instantly freeze anything hit by it, allowing for massive follow-up damage when the enemy is shattered, making this weapon in particular a menace in PvP, as stasis had kind of been running rampant and unchecked in there all year thus far. This season would also see two different finales, the first of which was the final expunge mission where we would finally put an end to Quria once and for all. The true finale, however, came during the second to last week of the season, wherein Lakshmi's attempts to sow discord and put a stop to the Vanguard's plans and expel the Elixni once and for all, she opened a Vex portal directly on top of the part of the city where they had been taking shelter. However, Lakshmi is not a guardian, and she is killed in the process, and we are sent in to make our final stand and protect the House of Light alongside Mithrax and Saint 14, who is a once feared enemy of the Elixni. With our victory and another ally gained, thus ended another very good season, second only to Season of the Chosen by the possibility of seasonal fatigue, but every bit as good in terms of content. Season of the Splicer came to an end on August 24th, 2021, and was followed up by Season of the Lost. Once again, Destiny saw another expansion delayed, but given the stakes of this next one, it was a bit understandable. Witch Queen had been much anticipated by players for a long time, as it was for all intents and purposes likely to be the sequel to the much beloved Taken King. But once again, Bungie needed a bit more time to make sure it came out in a good state. So it was pushed back almost 4 months, which would in turn make Season of the Lost even longer than Season of the Arrivals had been, but only by a little bit. Thankfully, Bungie did have a bit of a contingency plan this time around, with the addition of the Bungie 30th Anniversary Pack that would release in December, but until then, it was seasonal stuff. It turns out that ever since Osiris's run-in with the Wrathborn back during Season of the Hunt, he is actually not who he appeared to be, but was instead being possessed by none other than the final and most cunning of the Hive Gods, the Witch Queen herself, Savathun. In revealing herself to us, it turns out that she wasn't just hiding from us, but also the Pyramid Ships, who have been evidently searching the system high and low for her. After leaving Osiris's body, she encases herself in crystal, as much a prison as it is a final gambit to protect herself, like an insect in chrysalis, regaining strength. To get her out of the crystal, Marasov has a plan to use her Techians to remove Savathun once and for all. But it seems that Xivu Arath is not on her sister's or anyone else's side, as she has sent out more of her champions to assail the Dreaming City and the Last City. Using Awoken power, we are forced to delve into the Shattered Realm and defeat the Scorn and High forces of the Black Fleet, and rescue Mara's Techians in order to perform the ritual. The Shattered Realm was the premier activity of the season, with 3 different iterations. Rather than simple missions, these were more like play spaces, where completing the objectives could lead you to the end where you'd fight a boss, but all over the play space were various secrets and challenges players could complete for additional rewards and bonuses, making these some of the most robust and interesting activities Bungie had given us yet in the seasonal model. What's more, there was in fact another 6-player match-made activity, this time known as Astral Alignment. It was almost identical to the overrides of last season, just with a Dreaming City flavor, of course, and Scorn and Hive as the featured enemies. However, in the midst of all of this, Marasov finally learns about the guardianification of her brother as Crow, and this is where things get a bit awkward. While Crow doesn't really want to buy into their relationship, given that he is a completely different person now, Mara understandably can't let him go that easily. This leads us to the tale of Augur and Riga, the exotic quest that would reward us with the Stasis Trace Rifle, Augur's Scepter. High-key one of the greatest exotics in Destiny history. This absolute force of nature freezes everything it touches, and also freezes everything around that enemy in a small AoE attack. This can then be followed up with Shatters, making it one of the best crowd control weapons ever devised. It can also be overcharged with a long reload when the user has a full super meter, dealing substantially more damage until the super meter is completely drained. The seasonal exotic this time around was Lorentz Driver, a special ammo linear fusion rifle that would also cause implosions on headshots that would pull surrounding enemies in for extra damage. It could also eventually have its damage boosted by getting rapid kills and collecting the telemetry patterns dropped by those killed enemies. This was also a very strong weapon that was incredibly easy to use, and eventually had to be nerfed multiple times because of just how powerful it was. Season of the Lost length did, of course, offer it up to comparisons to something like Season of the Arrivals, and while it was very, very good, in some ways it was a bit more lacking. While it had plenty to do, arguably just as much as Chosen and Splicer, being active for 6 entire months will always take its toll on a season. Of course, the 30th anniversary pack would swoop in to save the day eventually, but that ended up having its own caveats, mainly that it actually cost $30, significantly more money than your standard season, which was a bit too steep for a lot of players that would in turn be stuck with only the seasonal stuff. Season of the Lost would culminate in a mission known as Exorcism, where players came together to help the Techians as they finally wrestled Savathun from her cocoon, and where we could all put down another hive god together. Of course, things did not go exactly as planned, and Savathun would use Osiris as a shield, allowing her to escape, thus setting up the events of the next expansion, the Witch Queen. Beyond Light got off to sort of a slow start because of the reality of the Destiny content vault, and rightfully so. It was and still is a poor decision on Bungie's part and would cause a very large chunk of the player base to leave in its wake. But for those who remained, the following seasons would serve to inspire a lot more confidence, as 3 hits in a row seemed to do a very good job of keeping everyone on board, ushering in another new age of Destiny that would only reach even higher peaks with the following expansion. We're still not quite done here just yet, however. In the next several episodes, we're going to be covering the content from the 30th anniversary pack before we say our goodbyes to the Beyond Light era of Destiny. But this will be the final seasonal recap video of the Let's Play. All future seasons will get proper and extensive coverage from here on out, as none of that stuff was relegated to the past at the time of recording, so I hope you're all looking forward to that. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.